All right. Welcome, everybody, back to Capital Connection. I'm Conan Smith. I'm the president and CEO of the Michigan Environmental Council. So glad to see you back again. We are going to have a really important conversation today with allies all across the country who are going to tell us a little bit about a backdoor strategy from the energy industry to continue delivering tar sands oil into the United States in ways that are actually seriously detrimental to the public health in many of our most significant communities. The issue was raised to us by MEC board member, Dr. Michael Dorsey. Dr. Dorsey is in Arizona today, so stay cool out there, my friend. Dorsey is a PhD in environmental justice, and we brought him onto the board as an advocate, as an expert, and he has been helping us keep on top of critical environmental health issues. Welcome back, Dr. Dorsey. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me again, Conan. It's always a pleasure to be here with you and everybody.
And Zoe Middleton joins us from Texas, from Harris County, where she works as the advisor on climate and infrastructure policy for Commissioner Rodney Ellis. Harris County, Texas, for those of us who don't spend a whole lot of time in Texas, is home to Houston, and right along the rail route that we're going to talk about today, and very similarly constructed from an economic standpoint, from an industrial and social standpoint as Detroit. And so the kinds of communities that are most impacted by this are reflected on both sides of this very long rail line as it comes through the United States. Zoe, thank you for bringing your expertise and your willingness to provide that national context to us.
Of course.
And Steve Geyer from one of our sibling organizations, the Iowa Environmental Council. Steve is their energy policy expert and sitting in the middle of the state. Those of you who have followed the Keystone Pipeline fight, you'll know that was a tar sands delivery mechanism that we were all able to pull together and stop. And this is the back door. So Steve, thank you for joining us from Iowa to provide some context around how this fight intersects with other energy policy issues in the petrochemical world. It's good to have your voice here.
Thanks, Conan. Appreciate it.
So the issue that we're grappling with is sort of quiet and mundane. It's the merger of a couple of rail lines, right? Like, which on the face of it, that doesn't seem like a big deal. Companies merge all the time. So this came to you, Dr. Dorsey. You brought it to me and said, "Hey, these two rail lines are going to get together." And I said to you, "So what?" Doesn't that happen all the time? And thanks to Commissioner Ellis, we have been able to articulate this as a backdoor strategy around tar sands oil. What triggered that for you, Dr. Dorsey? And tell us why you got so passionate about this particular issue.
Well, some of us and many listeners will know and viewers will know, we've been fighting against tar sands and dirty energy for a long time and had some victories along the way. And this was initially to me the similar, so what, a railway merger. But it's more than that, because this merger is going to ramp up pollution, not just in moving dirty energy, tar sands around the country and being a backdoor, trying to essentially roll back or overturn the victory we had in shutting down the XL pipeline. But the merger is going to increase the train traffic. It's going to increase the likelihood of accidents. It's going to put communities at greater risk, particularly Black and brown communities. So it's really a nefarious, insidious way to basically undermine the advances we've been making against climate change and to keep pushing dirty energy and deliver really 20th century problems on us in the 21st century and harm Black and brown communities disproportionately. So this is something that I wanted to flag. And I've also, as you know, in my role as a member of the board, been trying to get MEC to think about our role nationally and to think about the ways in which we can partner and connect with people, definitely in the Great Lakes region, but look at issues that cross the Great Lakes like this merger, but also reach out to and impact communities far beyond us, and we can play a role in uplifting that. So it was those two things, trying to fight this bad merger and expose the way in which it's harming communities, and then also center MEC in the broader conversation.
Zoe, excuse me, you and Commissioner Ellis, you've been sort of on the leading edge of this discovery and this fight. Can you provide a little context about what this railroad merger is technically, where you see an opportunity for intervention? I know you and the commissioner have written a letter to the federal government already. Can you just give our listeners a little bit of context about the situation itself?
Yeah, and so I just want to share a little bit more about Harris County before I begin, just to give
great.
you a sense of the scale and why we're so invested in this. We're the third largest county in the nation, home to about 5 million people. The commissioner represents a little over 1 million people, mostly in historically redlined neighborhoods, areas that have already experienced the brunt of environmental injustice in our region, including, in fact, a cancer cluster that is strongly related to creosote contamination from another large freight company, Union Pacific. So we really do understand the impact that freight has had on our region, which is also home to the second largest port in the United States. And, we're also, it bears mentioning, the energy capital and the extractive energy capital of the world. And so we really do feel an obligation to try to instill mitigation wherever possible, but also to kind of shepherd us towards a just transition from dirty energy, from extractive energy, from energy sources that pollute our air as they make their way to our gas tanks and into our homes. So that is why we were so attracted to this project. If you look at the proposed merger, which would be a merger between two of the smaller freight companies, there's already not a lot of freight companies in general. They've been consolidating over the years, and we can talk about the economic policy behind that and why that is breeding ground for corruption and great health risk in and of itself. But these are two smaller of the freight companies that are proposing to merge. And that pathway, as you mentioned, I saw it right away when I looked at the proposed merger pathway. If you look at where the line starts and where it ends, you can very clearly see this kind of pathway of extraction. And along that pathway, there's, thousands of communities, and Houston, Harris County, we're the largest one. And we have not been reached out to by either of the parties involved, CP or KCS, around potential mitigation, despite the fact that we have had well-documented fights to improve our air quality, despite the fact that we've been in very high profile back and forth with Union Pacific around our concerns about the impact that freight has on our region, and the fact that we're the second largest port. We're critical to the success or failure of this project, but we've been largely ignored. And so that's why we're so invested in trying to secure some kind of mitigation or a full-scale reconsideration. Right now, just yesterday, we sent a letter to the federal board that kind of oversees this project, not to get too wonky. And we told them, we haven't heard from CP, we haven't heard from KCS. There were inconsistencies in the environmental impact scoping, a lot of which took place, like the couple weeks before Christmas, which any organizer will tell you is not the best way to conduct community engagement, and it was all online. And so we asked for a little bit more respect and a little bit more consideration and a site visit so that they can really understand our concerns, they can breathe our air before this proposed merger starts, causing a massive uptick in traffic through the region.
And beyond the implications for Harris County, you all also reached out to folks like Dorsey. Like you saw the national implication and the desire to to elevate the context from a variety of community standpoints, which we're like so deeply appreciative for. I don't think we would be involved in this if it weren't for the leadership out of your office. Steve, can you help us a little bit to understand, like Zoe says, the interrelationship between this proposed merger between Canada Pacific and Kansas Star, and what that means in terms of the energy context and the delivery of petrochemicals across the country?
Sure, and so sort of stepping back a little bit in terms of the council's focus. So we're very focused on our energy transitions. We're very focused on the efforts to address climate change. And so any type of fossil extraction and then consumption of that is something that we're going to try and focus on, try and minimize, try and address it head on. Iowa has a lot of traffic basically coming through it in terms of rails. If we look at Burlington Northern and Union Pacific, they are major thoroughfares for bringing Powder River Basin coal through the state to states, certainly stopping here somewhat, but also major portions going east of us. This particular merger, we have a great concern in terms of what it will mean also, as we've already mentioned, in terms of increasing oil coming through the state. And we look at the aspects of even the rail itself and where that actually is located. And so if you look at the rail as it goes through Iowa, it is right on the Mississippi River. In fact, a lot of the tracks not only have many of the disadvantaged communities that we're concerned about, but we look at the risk that also is associated with that increased train traffic. So if the estimates are correct, where they're estimating that, communities that may have had 3 trains a day suddenly increased to 33 to 40 a day. And if those happen to be carrying, for instance, the oil through it or along it, we've seen accidents along this stretch before. And looking at the overall impact that it could produce if we had a major derailment, that would be, the equivalent of something like basically a major oil spill in the Gulf. So that's certainly part of our concern. But yes, we're also looking at the aspects of what does it mean in terms of, the idling of the cars themselves, as they basically have to wait for these trains to pass. And so that has an impact also. So briefly, that's sort of where we're looking at this right now.
Again, apologies. I'm learning the new Zoom and I left myself on mute there. The communities that are most impacted by this, you've both, Zoe and Steve, mentioned the environmental justice implications of that. We have in Texas and in Detroit both communities that are out of attainment for air quality standards for type 1 and type 2 pollutants. I want to share a little map of that. The impact on environmental justice communities from this increased traffic is one of the things that we are most concerned about as well. So there's not just a climate change consideration here, but also public health implications. Can Zoe, you talk, or Dorsey, you, about what it means to be in Houston, Dallas, Detroit, Chicago, when you see these massive increases in truck traffic that are generated by these freight yards?
Well, absolutely. And I'll be quick and defer to Zoe a bit, but we're going to see, increases, particularly in Detroit at the container terminal, sort of almost a doubling of, traffic to that facility, and it's going to result in more, particularly PM 2.5 pollution for those technical folks on the phone. That's the dirty, nasty pollution that affects folks certainly on the margins, Black and brown communities. It exacerbates folks with already, asthma and other, sort of breathing ailments, and elderly and so forth. But it's not just Detroit, but it's Minneapolis, it's Illinois, it's Kansas, it's all the way down to Texas, as we're talking about. And we're going to see increased pollution all along the way, and it's going to disproportionately fall and upend and undermine and cause more harm to the lives of Black and brown residents along this pathway?
Yeah, so I'll just set the stage a little bit about our public health side of this first. 24% of Black kids in Houston are diagnosed with asthma, and that's probably an undercount, frankly, given how Texas has the highest number of uninsured children, and so we don't have as many kids seeking healthcare. So that's probably an undercount. But I want to give you a sense of like that is what is at risk, and what is really for us front and center in this fight is that we not only understand the increase in pollution that's going to happen, but that we are mitigating it if wherever possible. And we're also developing new models. So, there's old data that's about 2014 from the EDF that hasn't gotten much better if you were to look at the newer data. But already in 2014 in Houston, the NOx emissions only from locomotive engines, right? Only from the kind of engines that would be passing through with even greater regularity was the equivalent of 3 million cars. Imagine putting 3 million more cars on the road in Houston, Texas is especially terrifying. And so I think that, not everyone sees a train every day. Not everyone, lives in a freight community. So there's a little bit of dissonance there, but I just wanted to put that kind of scale to it. I also wanted to talk a little bit about, there's a relationship between the jobs and the economies that we are supporting and propping up in public health. These are not the cleanest jobs. We are supporting growth in dirty sectors and sectors without really high risk to the workers. And so when we're thinking about public health, we can really take a broad view of this. It's not just the air that you breathe, it's the amount of risk that you're encountering when you clock in. And that is something that we need to have better answers from around KCS and CP about the level of safety and security that they're going to be providing workers as they're supporting this kind of growth and expansion and activity at our port and our truck yards and elsewhere. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about, y'all probably know, and I know Detroit floods as well, but Houston floods a lot. And our flooding is especially bad in areas where you have high levels of truck traffic and high levels of train traffic. There's a lot of impervious surface, so the water doesn't flow the way that it should, not to mention the fact that our infrastructure around drainage has been severely underinvested in. So what happens when you add many, many orders more trains going through these neighborhoods that already flood a lot? It means that when trains stall, which they frequently do for hours at a time throughout, like in the center of Houston, right? That you don't have an evacuation route. It also means that even when it's not flooding, there's really a lot of difficulty getting EMS and other emergency services in and out of the neighborhood. So imagine a kid having an asthma attack, needing an ambulance, and your ambulance can't get to you because you're blocked by a train. So these are the kind of things that we need assurances around, we need mitigation in place for, and we haven't heard any kind of willingness or seen any kind of indication of willingness to come to the table and show us the respect of like discussing what mitigation looks like, how you reduce the risk of this merger, which, both companies frankly seem very dedicated to just ramming through whether or not the environmental impact is and data is fully understood. So I just wanted to flag that. And the last thing I'll say is that we do have large chemical security concerns in our region. And so especially when you're transporting dirty stuff through a very, very crowded region, massive populations, and there are also chemical safety concerns that we haven't seen sufficiently addressed in any of the documents from KCS or CP.
One of the questions in the chat is about the legal and regulatory framework around railways and how they are able to be policed in the event of spills or handle their own policing. We also have a federal framework around rails because of interstate commerce and international commerce that gives them a little sort of extrajudicial authority in cases. Steve, can you talk a little bit about like your experiences in Iowa working when there have been these challenging disasters that you mentioned, derailments, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, as I think with most disasters, it's going to pick up with a state agency usually. So whether in our case, it's basically Department of Natural Resources would certainly take oversight in terms of a cleanup. As far as the legality of, sort of the structure of rail. Yeah, I mean, rail my opinion is they have a great deal of latitude in terms of how they govern themselves. So that's part of a difficulty in terms of trying to assess what the impact is going to be from a merger like this. The other aspect I looked at in terms of, what will this merger actually do? And so, then we come back to the yet to be produced environmental impact statement. And even looking at the scoping of that study, my impression was, you had to reach this threshold before they would analyze. So, certain number of train threshold increase before I'm even going to analyze what the impact's going to be. So there was some, I'll just say, concern in terms of, will the statement actually be accurate in terms of its whole impact? I have questions around that, but certainly there's opportunity to comment as it goes through that phase.
Our friend Kevin Brubaker from the Environmental Law and Policy Center also posted a question that I'm not sure if we have the answer to, but I'll pitch it out to you all. Kevin's worked on transportation policy for a couple of decades now, wondering if the proposed merger is going to increase rail traffic versus shift rail traffic from other lines into this one, and how much of that is related to shifting freight off of trucks and onto trains, that sort of thing. Has anybody taken a look at that yet?
I've looked at it a little bit, and I don't want to get too in the weeds on it, but I will say in our region, it will increase traffic by about 13%, and they'll be operating all on Union Pacific lines because that's who own the line. So they're going to enter into I assume, third agreement to allow for that increase in traffic. And there is definitely a relationship between, shifting freight off of trucks and onto trains. And there's been a lot of self-congratulatory talk about how, oh, well, trains are a little bit cleaner than trucks, and and so we're doing the right thing. But I don't know how much that marginal difference in cleanliness between trains and trucks matters to someone that's, having an asthma attack or can't get out of their neighborhood because of, hours long train derailment or, all of the other stuff. I'll also say there's, it's not like things don't magically fall onto trains. They do also rely on truck yards and whatnot. So yeah, in our region, it's definitely going to increase. And I think that, another part of the frustration that we've had is this lack of honesty around, or a little bit of like hiding the ball around just exactly, the impact that it's going to have on us and the amount of impact that they're willing to recognize and do mitigation around. And we haven't seen really any proactive or good faith efforts around that.
For us in the Detroit area, Dr. Dorsey, you mentioned the increases that this will come. So I don't know if this addresses the sort of more global mathematics on where trucks and trains interface across multiple lines, but just looking exclusively at this merger in Metro Detroit, we would see a 70% increase in rail car traffic, but an 87% increase in trucks handled at the Detroit Intermodal facility on a daily basis. So it seems to me like the merger is going to result in increased impacts both from trains and trucks in our area, again, outside the context of how that affects all other lines that are out there.
Yeah, briefly on Iowa, Conan, I mean, I looked, and so we don't have any of the intermodals that they currently have on their line. That doesn't mean they couldn't create a new one. But as I look at basically the opportunity to sort of switch from modes, you pretty much have to have one of those facilities to accomplish that.
Yeah, I was going to add, look, this is bad all the way around. It's bad. And what's really important as we come up to the time is that we're coming together in a way that we don't typically do at MEC and reaching out to our friends, in Iowa and all the way down to Houston and at all points in between to say that this is obviously a bad decision for many of the reasons we've already discussed, but we're going to put up a unified front to stop this kind of new 21st century, train racism. You know, we know about environmental racism, we know about environmental injustice, but now we can coin the phrase on this webinar, train racism. And we need to get ahead of that to stop this from harming and marginalizing and undermining communities, and not just Black and brown communities, but this is a threat to, I'll say it, national security, because it puts at risk the lives of white folks, Black and brown folks, and all folks.
So we also have a really interesting opportunity to impede or influence this merger process, which doesn't exist with other corporate mergers, right? Like often these just happen, between companies. Maybe the SEC gets involved if there's some stock exchanges. But here, in the case of transportation, the Federal Surface Transportation Board is going to have a say on this merger. Zoe, you all initiated action with them pending a letter. Can you describe to folks how they can influence this process and make sure that their voice is heard as the federal government weighs in on whether or not to approve this merger?
Yeah, so this will go through an entire environmental impact screening process. We're in the early stages of scoping that out, and they're developing an understanding of what all the environmental impacts will be. And so if you follow along, there's a standalone site for this merger that I think was posted in the chat. There will be key dates and points at which you can participate either via virtual hearing or a site visit if you're lucky enough to have them come to where you are. And it's also worth, of course, talking to local electeds and seeing if there's appetite. I know there has been in several places along the project pathway already. And if this kind of, jives with their worldview around, reducing the risk of climate crisis and climate disaster, chemical safety, workers' rights, air pollution. It really does run the gamut. So I think that to the extent that you have an elected in your area that cares about even one of those things, this is something worth them paying attention to and worth local advocates paying attention to as well. I know that the community engagement side of things has not been as robust as we would have hoped. And hopefully part of this advocacy will include improving it. So that's why we requested a site hearing, and that's why we're working with our local partners to make sure that our site hearing is full of people that had no clue that the scoping hearings were happening in the first place back in November. It's part of our job to follow along the kind of boring parts that are hard to corral people around, and then get people excited and help them connect the dots as well. So.
Well, really appreciate the reminder about those localized impacts. We've had in the chat a couple of folks raising the Metro Detroit and the city of Detroit are really trying to rethink the nature of the community and the economy there, and have posited a 21st century zone around one of our former rail stations, which is going through massive redevelopment. Like a real opportunity for us to think differently about what we want, how we want transportation to play a role in our future. So it's good advice for us to make it local, make it matter to the folks in our own communities. We're about at the hour, so I want to say thank you to all of you. Dr. Dorsey, it's great to have you on our board and raising issues like this. Zoe, we really want you to come back home to Michigan. You didn't get to say that at the very beginning, but Zoe
so does my mom. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Great. We got good advocacy. Native Michigander out in Texas helping us here. Thank you so much for the insights and wisdom. And Steve, from the middle of the country, the heartland, much appreciate you taking time, and very good luck at the Iowa Environmental Council. Love having an ally like you working hard on these issues. For those of you out in internet land, we do these Capital Connections on the regular, and our next two are actually going to be focused on a couple of great people that we are going to celebrate at MEC's annual event on July 21st at Eastern Market in Detroit. So coming up next, we're going to talk with Diane Cheklik, who's going to receive our Petoskey Prize for Outstanding Volunteer Leadership. Diane has helped restore native habitats within the city of Detroit for birds, and she's a member of the Detroit Audubon Society. Subsequent to that, we'll be talking with Tom Wywoody, one of our Milliken Prize awardees with his wife, Ann. Ann ran the Sierra Club here for 30 years. Tom recently retired from the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, where he started the Greenways initiative in the city. So we're going to be talking about the Joe Louis Greenway project, a massive $110 million attempt to create multimodal mobility around the city. So I hope you'll all join us for that again. And again, to our guests, thank you. To our watchers, thank you. I hope to see you again at the Capital Connection, and we will make sure, Dr. Dorsey, to work with Steve and Zoe to bring concerted advocacy across the country to make sure that the impacts of any of these mergers are minimized and that the environmental justice and environmental health issues are elevated in the discussion process. Thank you all. Have a very good weekend.